1942, the year when the world first understood that Japanese soldiers followed a code so unbreakable that surrender was not even a thought in their minds. In jungles, islands, and mountains across the Pacific, the Japanese soldier became a symbol of unshakable resolve, a fighter who believed that to be captured was far worse than death itself. This belief came from centuries of warrior tradition, from the teachings of Bushido, and from the strict military culture of Imperial Japan, which turned ordinary men into warriors who saw honor as the highest form of life and shame as a fate worse than dying on the battlefield. The roots of this mindset went far deeper than simple nationalism. It was woven into the history of Japan from the age of the samurai, when warriors were taught that fear and surrender were weaknesses that destroyed the spirit. Japanese soldiers in the Second World War were trained from childhood through school and society to admire the ideal of the warrior who would never yield even when surrounded, starving, or hopelessly outnumbered. The emperor was seen as a living divine being, and dying in his name was considered the most noble act a soldier could achieve. 1937. In the early years of the conflict in China, Japanese commanders reinforced a belief that surrender was the ultimate disgrace. Training camps hammered this idea into every new recruit. Men were told again and again that being taken prisoner would dishonor their families, their ancestors, and their nation. They were warned that returning alive after surrender would bring humiliation to their communities. Soldiers were encouraged to imagine that capture was a stain that would never wash away. The Imperial Japanese Army believed that only absolute obedience and unbreakable mental strength could secure victory in the wars to come. This training was not only physical but psychological. Soldiers were isolated from civilian life, cut off from outside news, and instructed to think only as warriors. They marched long distances with little rest, endured harsh discipline, and were sometimes beaten publicly for making even the smallest mistakes. This was not unusual or considered cruel. It was understood as part of forging a perfect soldier, a man who would not question orders or hesitate in the face of impossible odds. 1941. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, the world saw the intensity of Japanese military commitment. This was not simply a strategic attack. It reflected decades of built-up belief in Japanese destiny and the idea that dying in battle was the greatest honor possible. Pilots who carried out the attack believed they were striking for the survival and glory of their nation. They believed deeply that Japan was locked in a struggle for its rightful place in the world, and that this mission represented righteous duty. Once the war expanded across Asia, the Pacific Islands became vast battlegrounds, and Japanese soldiers defending remote outposts were often cut off from supplies and support. They survived on minimal rations, reused equipment, and the force of pure will. They were told that the shame of surrender would follow their families for generations, and that they must choose death instead of capture, even when surrounded and starving. Many soldiers launched suicidal charges rather than accept defeat because they believed that dying with honor was the only acceptable ending. 1943. On Guadalcanal and New Guinea, Allied troops discovered something they had never seen before: soldiers who chose death over surrender. Even when defeat was certain, Japanese forces refused to give up positions, even when wounded, exhausted, or cornered. Some soldiers charged with bayonets against machine gun fire. Some used grenades on themselves rather than be captured. Others hid in jungles for days or weeks, continuing to fight long after their units were destroyed. Their commanders encouraged this mindset, telling them that Japan did not recognize prisoners of war, and that to be captured was to become less than human. These beliefs were strengthened by military propaganda. Newspapers, radio broadcasts, and school textbooks in Japan glorified heroic last stands and depicted surrender as betrayal. The culture around death was transformed into something sacred. Soldiers were expected to write farewell letters before leaving for the front, preparing themselves mentally for the possibility that they would never return. Everyone believed that the emperor was watching, and that the spirits of dead warriors expected nothing less than total sacrifice. 1944 on Saipan, the world witnessed the most extreme example of this mindset when entire units and even civilians refused to surrender and instead chose mass death. Saipan showed the depth of Japanese loyalty and fear of shame. Soldiers fought until ammunition was gone, then turned to swords, knives, and anything they could find. Civilians, influenced by years of propaganda, believed that Americans would torture or kill them, leading many to jump from cliffs rather than fall into enemy hands. This tragedy revealed how powerful the culture of no surrender had become. It was more than military discipline, it was a national belief that surrender was equal to losing one's soul. At the same time, the Japanese military used fear as a tool. Officers sometimes executed their own men for retreating without the possibility of surrender. Soldiers saw no other choice but to keep fighting to the last breath. The army enforced the idea that even thinking about giving up was weakness. Every soldier was expected to die with honor, and those who did not were judged harshly in death. 1945, when the war reached Okinawa, the Japanese army again showed a level of resistance that stunned Allied forces. Defenders hid in caves, tunnels, and underground bunkers, fighting silently and fiercely for every inch of ground they held. Their positions long after defeat became obvious. Many units fought until only a handful survived, and even then refused to surrender. Some soldiers pretended to be dead, then attacked enemy troops at night. Others sealed themselves inside caves, choosing death by fire or explosives instead of emerging and being taken prisoner. Kamikaze attacks in the final year of the war represented the ultimate expression of the no-surrender mindset. Pilots were trained to believe that dying in a suicide mission was the highest form of sacrifice. Thousands of young men volunteered, believing that offering their life for the emperor was the greatest gift they could give to their country. Their letters home showed a mixture of fear, pride, and deep cultural belief in noble death. 1955, years after the war ended, the world was shocked when Japanese holdouts were still found alive. Refusing to believe that Japan had surrendered on remote islands, soldiers hid for years, refusing rescue attempts. They believed messages announcing the end of the war were enemy tricks. Some continued scavenging, surviving on plants and animals, and maintaining their weapons, as if battle might begin again at any moment. They lived alone, cut off from the world, driven entirely by the conviction that a Japanese soldier must never surrender. 1974, the most famous case was Hiro Onoda, who stayed hidden for 29 years on Lubang Island. Onoda carried out small missions, kept his rifle clean, and waited for orders. He only surrendered when his former commander traveled to the island in person and relieved him of duty. This remarkable devotion, even decades after the war, showed how powerful and long-lasting the no-surrender belief had been. The code of Bushido and military indoctrination had shaped men so deeply that not even time could break their loyalty. The legacy of Japanese soldiers never surrendering became a defining part of World War II history. Historians still debate how Japan created such unwavering mental resilience. Some say it was the product of Bushido, ancient honor, and strict discipline. Others argue that it was built from fear, cultural pressure, and national propaganda, but all agree that Japanese soldiers were among the most determined fighters in the war. Their refusal to surrender changed the course of many battles, made the Pacific War far more brutal, and left a reputation that continues to fascinate the world today. Their story is not just about war, it is about belief, culture, identity, and the human capacity for absolute conviction. It shows how ideas can shape actions, how loyalty can surpass survival, and how entire nations can be influenced by a single code of honor that tells warriors never to yield no matter the cost.